lying one summer night below the stars, when the Milky Way was spanning the sapphire zenith, and the wind had fallen asleep in the high sombre pines. I heard this tale as a whispering born from strange worlds beyond the Scorpion. Not as the plants and flowers of earth, growing peacefully beneath a simple sun, were the blossoms of a planet Lopi, coiling and uncoiling in double dawns, tossing tumultuously to enormous suns of jade green and ballast ruby orange. Swaying and weltering in rich twilights, they resembled fields of rooted servants that dance eternally to another world music. Many were small and furtive, and crept in the fashion of vipers on the low ground. Others were tall as pythons, rearing proudly to the jewelled light in hieratic postures. Some were like abdominous wyverns with long, slender throats and coronals of scroll-shaped antennae, and some bore the far-off likeness of pygmy cockadrills with high carmine-tinted combs. The flowers grew with single or double stems that burgeoned into hydra heads, or triple or quadruple stems that joined again to put forth a single blossom. They were frilled and festooned with vari-coloured leaves that suggested the wings of flying lizards, the pennons of fairy lances, the phylacteries of an alien sacerdotalism. They bloomed with petals that issued like flaming tongues from ebon mouths, or curled in starlit wattles as of wild dragons turned to plants by a wizard spell, or floated on the air in deep reticulations as of fleshy nets of madder and rose, or hung aloft like bucklers of exotic war. They were armed with venomous darts, with deadly fangs, and many possessed the power of fatal constriction. All were weirdly alive and sentient, were malignly restless and alert, save in the irregular, infrequent winters when Lopi hung at its twofold aphelion. Then they ceased their perennial tossing in a brief torpor, and folded their monstrous petals beneath the rays that fall obliquely from remote poles. The flowers were the lords of Lopi, and all other life existed only by their sufferance. The people of the world had been their inferiors from unrecorded cycles, and even in the oldest myths there was no suggestion that any other order of things had ever prevailed. And the plants themselves, together with the fauna and mankind of Lopi, gave immemorial obeisance to that supreme and terrible flower known as the Vorpal, in which a tutelary demon, more ancient than the twin suns, was believed to have made its immortal avatar. The Vorpal was served by a human priesthood, chosen from amid the royalty and aristocracy of Lopi. In the heart of the chief city, Lospa, in an equatorial realm it had grown from antiquity, on the summit of a high pyramid of sable terraces that overloomed the town like the hanging gardens of some greater Babylon, crowded with the lesser but deadly floral forms. At the center of the broad apex, the Vorpal stood alone in a basin level with the surrounding platform of black mineral. The basin was filled with a compost in which the dust of royal mummies formed an essential ingredient. The tall demonian flower sprang from a bulb so old, so encrusted with the growth of centuries, that it resembled an urn of stone. Above this there rose the gnarled and mighty stalk that had displayed in earlier times the bifurcation of a mandrake, but whose halves had now grown together into a scaly, furrowed thing like the tail of some mythic sea monster. The stalk was variegated with hues of greening bronze, of antique copper, with the sere yellows and burnt madders of tropic autumn, the livid blues and deathly purples of carnal corruption. It ended in a crown of stiff, blackish leaves, banded and spotted with poisonous metallic white, and edged with sharp serrations, as of savage weapons. From below the crown there issued a long, sinuous arm, scaled like the main stem, and serpentining downward and outward to terminate in the huge upright bowl of bizarre blossom, as if the arm, in sardonic fashion, should hold out a hellish beggar's cup. Abhorrent and monstrous was the bowl, which, like the leaves, was legended to renew itself at intervals of 1,000 years. It smouldered at the base with sullen ruby steeped in sepulchral shadow. It lightened into zones of sultry dragon's blood, into belts of the rose of infernal sunset on the fluted swelling sides. And it flamed at the rim to a yellowish naccarat red, like the ichor of salamandrine devils. To one who dared to peer within, the deep braille was lined with funereal violet, blackening toward the bottom, pitted with myriad pores and striated with turgescent veins of sulphurous green. Swaying slowly in a weird, lethal, hypnotic rhythm, with a deep and solemn sibilation, the Vorpal dominated the city of Lospa and the world Lopi. Below, on the tiers of the pyramid, the thronged ophidian plants kept time to this rhythm in their tossing and hissing. And far beyond Lospa, to the poles of the planet and in all its longitudes, the fields of living blossoms obeyed the sovereign tempo of the Vorpal. Boundless was the power exercised by this being over the people who, for want of a better name, I had called the humankind of Lo-Fi. Many and frightful were the legends that had gathered through aeons about the Vorpal, and dire was the sacrifice demanded each year at the summer solstice by the demon, the filling of its proffered cup with the lifeblood of a priest or priestess, chosen from amid the assembled hierophants, who passed before the Vorpal till the poised cup, inverted and empty, descended like a devil's mitre on the hapless head of one of their number. Lunithi, king of the realms about Lospa and high priest of the Vorpal, was the last, if not the first, of his race to rebel against this singular and sinister domination. There were doubtful myths of some primordial ruler who had dared to refuse the required sacrifice, and whose people, in consequence, had been decimated by a mortal war with the serpentine Plich, obeying the angry demon, had uprooted themselves everywhere from the soil, and had marched on the cities of Lo-Fi, slaying or vampirizing all who fell in their way. Lunithi, from childhood, had obeyed implicitly, and without question, the will of the floral overlord, had offered the stated worship, had performed the necessary rites. To withhold them would have been blasphemy. He had not dreamt of rebellion till, at the time of the annual choosing of the victim, and 30 suns before the date of his nuptials with Nala, priestess of the Vorpal, he saw the hesitant, inverted Grail come down in deathly crimson on the fair head of his betrothed. A mute and sorrowful consternation, a sullen, recalcitrant dismay, which he sought to smother even in his own heart, was experienced by Lunithi. Nala, dazed and resigned, in a mystic inertia of despair, accepted her doom without question, but a blasphemous doubt formed itself surreptitiously in the mind of the king. Scarcely he dared admit the thought to full consciousness, lest the demon should know by means of its telepathic powers, and visit him some baleful retribution. Trembling with his own impiety, he asked himself if there was not some way in which he could save Nala from the sacrificial knife, could cheat the demon of its ghastly tribute. To do this, and escape with impunity to himself and his subjects, he knew infallibly that he must strike at the very life of the monster, which was believed to be deathless and invulnerable. It seemed impious even to wonder concerning the truth of this unanimous belief, which had long assumed the force of a religious tenet among the peoples of Lo-Fi. Amid such reflections as these, Lunithi remembered an old myth about the existence of a neutral and independent being known as the Occlith, a demon coeval with the Vorpal, and allied neither to man nor to the flower creatures. This being was said to dwell beyond the desert of Apham, in the otherwise unpeopled mountains of white stone that are never visited by snow, and which lie above the habitat of the Ophidian blossoms. In latter days, at least, no man had seen the Occlith, for the journey through Apham was a thing not likely to be undertaken. But this entity was supposed to be immortal, and it lived apart and alone, meditating upon all things and interfering never with their processes. However, it was said to have given, in earlier times, valuable advice concerning affairs of state to a certain king who had gone forth from Lospa to its lair among the white crags. In his grief and desperation, Lunithi resolved to seek the Occlith, and to question it anent the possibility of slaying the Vorpal. If, by any mortal means, the demon could be destroyed, he would remove from Lo-Fi the long-established tyranny, whose shadow fell upon all things from the sabled pyramid. It was necessary for him to proceed with utmost caution, to confide in no one, to veil his very thoughts at all times from the occult scrutiny of the Vorpal. In the interim of 5 days between the choosing of the victim and the consummation of the sacrifice, he must carry out his mad plan. Unattended, and disguised as a simple herder, Lunithi left his palace during the brief night of universal 3-hour slumber, and stole forth toward the desert, through fields comparatively free of the serpentine growths. In the dawn of the Balas ruby sun, he had reached the pathless waste, and was toiling painfully over its knife-sharp ridges of dark stone, like the waves of a mounting ocean petrified in storm. Soon the rays of the green sun were added to those of the other, and Apham became a painted inferno through which Lunithi dragged his way, crawling from scarp to glassy scarp and resting at whiles in the coloured shadows. There was no water anywhere, but swift mirages gleamed and faded, and the sifting sand appeared to run like rills in the bottom of deep, flaming valleys. At setting of the first sun, Lunithi came within sight of the pale mountains beyond Apham, towering like a precipice of frozen foam above the desert's darker sea. They were tinged with evanescent lights of azure and jade and orange in the going of the yellow-red orb and the westward slanting of its binary. Then the lights melted into tourmaline and beryl, and the green sun was regnant over all till it too went down, leaving a twilight whose colours were those of shoaling sea-water. In the gloom Lunity reached the foot of the lower crags, and there, exhausted, he slept till the second dawn. Rising, he began his escalade of the White Mountains, which rose bleak and terrible before him against the hidden suns, with cliffs that were sheer as the terraces of Titans. Like the king who had gone before in the ancient myth, he found the precarious way that led upward through narrow, broken chasms. At last he came to the vaster fissure, riving the heart of the White Range, by which it was possible to reach the legendary lair of the Occlith. The beetling walls of the chasm rose higher and higher above him, shutting out the double daylight, but creating with their pallor a wan and deathly glimmer to illumine his way through the dusk. The fissure was such as might have been cloven by the sword of a macrocosmic giant. It led downward, steepening ever, like a wound that pierced the heart of Lo-Fi. Lunity, like all its race, was able to exist for prolonged periods without other nutriment than sunlight and water. He had brought with him a metal flask filled with the aqueous element of Lo-Fi, from which he drank sparingly as he descended along the chasm. For, like Apham itself, the White Mountains were waterless, and he feared to touch the rills and pools of unknown fluids upon which he came at intervals in the gloom. There were sanguine-coloured springs that bubbled from the walls, to vanish in fathomless rifts, and sluggish brooklets of mercurial metal, green, blue, or amber, that wound beside him like lucescent serpents, and then disappeared mysteriously in dark caverns. Acrid metallic vapours rose from clefts in the chasm floor, and Lunity felt himself among strange alchemies and chemistries of nature. In this fantastic world of stone, which the plants of Lo-Fi could never invade, he seemed to have gone beyond the satanic tyranny of the Vorpal. At last he came to a clear, hueless pool that almost filled the entire width of the chasm, leaving on one side a narrow, insecure ledge along which he was forced to scramble. A fragment of the marble stone, loosened by his passing, fell into the pool as he gained the opposite edge, and the clear liquid foamed and hissed like 1,000 vipers. Wondering as to its properties and fearful of the virulent hissing, which did not subside for some time, Lunity hurried on, and came after an interval to the end of the fissure. Here he emerged in the huge crater-like pit that was the home of the Occlith. Fluted and columned walls went up to an overwhelming height on all sides, and the sun of orange ruby, now at zenith, was pouring down a vertical cataract of gorgeous fire and shadows. Addest against the further wall of the pit, Lunity beheld that fabulous being known as the Occlith, which had the likeness of a high cruciform pillar of blue mineral, shining with its own esoteric lustre. Going forward, he prostrated himself before the pillar, and then, in accents that quavered with a deep awe, he ventured to ask the desired oracle. For a while the Occlith maintained its Aeonian silence. Peering timidly, the king perceived the twin lights of mystic silver that brightened and faded with a slow, regular pulsation in the arms of the blue cross. Then, from the lofty shining thing, by means of no visible organ, there issued a voice that was like the tinkling of mineral fragments lightly clashed together, but which somehow shaped itself into articulate words. "It is possible," said the Occlith, "to slay the plant known as the Vorpal, in which an elder demon has its habitation. Though the flower has attained the millennial age, it is not necessarily immortal, for all things have their proper term of existence and decay, and nothing has been created without its corresponding agency of death. I do not advise you to slay the plant, but I can furnish you with the information which you desire. In the mountain chasm through which you came to seek me, there flows a hueless spring of mineral poison, deadly to all the ophidian plant life of this world," the Occlith went on, and told Lunity the manner in which the poison should be prepared and administered. The chill, toneless, tinkling voice concluded, "If there is anything more that you wish to learn, it would be well to ask me now." Prostrating himself again, Lunity gave thanks to the Occlith, and, considering that he had learned all that was requisite in regard to the Vorpal, he did not avail himself of the opportunity to question further the strange entity of living stone. And the Occlith, cryptic and aloof in its termless, impenetrable meditation, apparently saw fit to vouchsafe nothing more except an answer to a direct query. Withdrawing from the marble-walled abyss, Lunity returned in haste along the narrow chasm, till, reaching the clear pool of which the Occlith had spoken, he paused to empty his water flask and fill it with the angry, hissing liquid. Then he resumed his journey. At the end of 2 days, after incredible fatigues and torments in the blazing hell of Apham, he reached Losbar in a time of darkness and slumber, as when he had departed. Since his absence had been unannounced, it was supposed by everyone that he had retired to the underground Adita, below the pyramid of the Vorkwall for purposes of prolonged meditation, as was sometimes his wont. In fearful hope and trepidation, dreading the miscarriage of his plan, and shrinking still from its audacious impiety, Lunethi awaited the night preceding the double dawn of summer solstice, when, in a secret room of the Black Pyramid, the monstrous offering was to be prepared. Nala would be slain by a fellow priest or priestess, chosen by lot, and her lifeblood would drip from the channeled altar into a great cup, and the cup would then be borne with solemn rites to the Vorkwall, and its contents poured into the evilly supplicative bowl of the sanguinated blossom. He saw little of Nala during that brief interim. She was more withdrawn than ever, and seemed to have consecrated herself wholly to the coming doom. To no one, and least of all to his beloved, did Lunethi dare to hint a possible prevention of the sacrifice. There came the dreaded eve, with its swiftly changing twilight of jewelled and its darkness hung with auroral flames. Lunethi stole across the sleeping city and entered the pyramid, whose massive blackness towered amid the frail and open architecture of buildings that were little more than canopies and lattices of stone. With infinite caution, hiding his real intention in the nethermost crypts of his mind, he made the preparations prescribed by the Occlith. Into the huge sacrificial cup of black metal, in a room eternally lit with stored sunlight, he emptied the seething, sibilant poison he had brought with him from the White Mountains. Then, opening with surgical adroitness a vein in one of his arms, he added a certain amount of his own life fluid to the lethal potion. The blood appeared to quiet that angry venom, above whose foaming crystal it floated like a magic oil, without mingling, so that the entire cup, to all appearance, was filled with the liquid most acceptable to the satanic blossom. Bearing in his hands the black brail, Lunethi mounted a coiling stairway that led to the Vorkwall's presence. His heart quailing within him, his senses swooning in chill gulfs of superstitious terror, he emerged on the lofty sable summit above the shadowy town. In a luminous azure gloom, against the weird and iridescent streamers of light that foreran the double dawn, he saw the dreamy swaying of the monstrous plant, and heard its somnolent hissing that was answered drowsily by innumerable blossoms on the terraces below. A nightmare oppression, black and tangible, seemed to flow from the pyramid and to lie in stagnant shadow on all the lands of Lo-Fi. Aghast at his own temerity, and deeming that his shrouded thoughts would surely be understood as he drew nearer, or that the Vorkwall would be suspicious of an offering brought before the customary hour, Lunethi made obeisance to his floral overlord. The Vorkwall vouchsafed no sign that it had deigned to perceive his presence, but the great flower cup, with its flaring crimsons dulled to garnet and purple in the twilight, was held forward as if in readiness to receive the hideous gift. Breathless and fainting with religious fear, in a moment of suspense that seemed eternal, Lunethi poured the blood-mantled poison into the yawning cup. The venom boiled and hissed like a wizard's brew as the thirsty flower drank it up, and Lunethi saw the coiling arm draw back in sudden doubt, and tilt its demonian grail quickly, as if to repudiate the sacrificial draught. It was too late, for the poison had been absorbed by the blossom's porous lining. The tilting motion changed in mid-air to an agonized writhing of the serpentine arm, and then the Vorkwall's huge scaly stalk and serrate leaf crown began to toss in a frenetic dance of death, waving darkly against the auroral curtains of morn. Its deep, solemn hissing sharpened to an insupportable note, fraught with the pain of a dying devil, and looking down from the platform edge on which he crouched to avoid the swaying growth, Lunethi saw that the lesser plants on all the black terraces beneath were tossing in mad unison with their master. Like noises in an evil dream, he heard the chorus of their tortured sibilations. He dared not look again at the Vorkwall, till he became aware of a strange, unnatural silence, and saw that the blossoms below had ceased to writhe and were drooping limply on their stems. Then, incredulous, he knew that the Vorkwall was dead. Turning, in mingled horror and triumph, he beheld the flaccid stalk that had fallen prone on its bed of unholy compost. He saw that a sudden withering of the stiff, sordid leaves of the gross and hellish flower. Even the stony bulb appeared to collapse and crumble before his eyes. The entire stem, with its evil colours fading swiftly, shrank and fell in upon itself like a sere and empty serpent skin. At the same time, in some obscure manner, Lunethi was still aware of a presence that brooded above the pyramid. Even in the death of the Vorkwall, it seemed to him that he was not alone. Then, as he stood and waited, fearing he knew not what, He felt the passing of a cold and unseen thing in the azure gloom, a thing that flowed across his body like the coils of some enormous python, without sound, in dark and clammy undulations. A moment more and it was gone, and Lunathy no longer felt the brooding presence. He turned to go, and it seemed that the dying night was ominous of an unconceived terror that gathered before him as he went down the long volutes of sombre stairs. Slowly he descended, and a weird despair was upon him. He had slain the Vorpal, had seen it wither in death, so Nala should be saved from the morrow's sacrifice. Yet he could not believe the thing he had done. The lifting of the ancient doom was still no more than an idle myth. The twilight had begun to brighten as he passed through the slumbering city. According to custom of Lo-Fi, no one would be abroad for another hour. Then the priests of the Vorpal would gather for the annual rite of blood offering. Midway between the pyramid and his own palace, Lunathy was more than startled to meet the maiden Nala. Pale and ghostly, she glided by him with a swift and swaying movement almost serpentine, which differed strangely from her habitual languor. Lunathy dared not accost her when he saw her shut, unheeding eyes, like those of a somnambulist, and he was deeply awed and troubled by the serpentine ease, the unnatural surety of her motion. It reminded him of something which he feared to remember. In a turmoil of fantastic doubt and apprehension, he followed her, threading the exotic maze of Losbar with the fleet and sinuous glide of a homing serpent. Nala entered the sacred pyramid. Lunathy, less swift than the maiden, had fallen behind, and he knew not where she had gone in the myriad vaults and interior chambers. But a strange and fearsome intuition drew his steps without delay to the platform of the summit. He knew not what he should find, but his heart was drugged with an esoteric hopelessness, and he was aware of no surprise when he came forth in the many-coloured dawn and beheld the thing which awaited him. The maiden Nala, or that which he knew to be Nala, was standing in the basin of evil soil above the withered remains of the Vorpal. She had was still undergoing, a monstrous and diabolic transformation. Her frail, slight body had assumed a long and dragon-like form, and the tender skin was marked off in incipient scales that darkened momentarily with a mottling of baleful hues. Her head was no longer recognizable as such, and the human lineaments were flaring into a weird semicircle of pointed leaf buds. Her lower limbs had joined together, had rooted themselves in the ground. One of her arms was becoming a part of the Ophidian bowl, and the other was lengthening into a scaly stem that bore the dark red bud of a sinister blossom. More and more the monstrosity took on the similitude of the Vorpal, and Lunathy, crushed by the ancient awe and dark, terrible faith of his ancestors, could feel no longer any doubt of its true identity. Soon there was no trace of Nala in the thing before him, which began to sway with a dreamy, python-like rhythm, and to utter a deep and measured sibilation, to which the plants on the lower tiers responded. He knew then that the Vorpal had returned to claim its sacrifice, and preside forever above the city, Losbar, and the world, Lobhai.